And you're watching special coverage of Nigeria's 2023 presidential and parliamentary elections, National Assembly, here on Arise News. Well, let's move away from the collation centre and take a look at the fate of journalists during this election, how they have fared in an election that's been marred by irregularities. For more on this, we're joined by Jonathan Rosen. He's a senior researcher at the Committee to Protect Journalists. Jonathan, thank you very much indeed for joining us. What are you actually doing in Nigeria at this time?
Well, we at the Committee to Protect Journalists are here to follow the election, to document incidents that involve journalists being denied access, being attacked, or being harassed. And unfortunately, on Saturday during the election, we documented cases involving at least 14 journalists who were either detained, harassed, or attacked.
And why was this so, and in which places did this happen?
It happened in various places across the country, Bayelsa, in Lagos, in Abuja, but the most prominent and the most critical case was actually in Bauchi, where a journalist was detained and actually remains in detention now. And his name is Haruna Muhammad Salisu. He was in court today and was charged and was remanded in prison, actually.
And do you know why he was detained and charged?
Well, he was covering the election. He had just interviewed the governor of Bauchi in the governor's hometown with other reporters and had begun interviewing women who were protesting nearby. So political supporters then attacked him and the police intervened, taking him into custody. Initially, the police said that he was in custody for his own safety, but then they denied releasing him. And so subsequently, he's been charged with inciting public disturbance against the governor. This charge came today when he was in court. His lawyer has asked for bail. That was opposed by the Attorney General of the state, and he'll be back in court tomorrow.
And in those circumstances, what do you do? What does your committee do to protect those journalists?
It's a good question. We've called for the release of Haruna alongside a coalition of press freedom groups here in Nigeria. We're drawing attention here today with you to these issues to make sure that journalists get the respect they need when they're out on the job, to make sure that the Nigerian public and the public around the world can be informed about the elections.
Well, has it just been arrests? Because you talk about arrests and you talk about journalists being barred. Being barred from what exactly?
Well, days before the election, we saw journalists in Ocean being denied access to monitor electoral processes, the movement of election materials. We've seen journalists who were stopped by security forces as they move between polling places. It's a fundamental question of access. If journalists aren't able to be in the places where the news is happening, how will people know what is happening?
Absolutely. And just beyond those specific cases that you mentioned, I mean, obviously you're a journalist yourself, and I mean, you've been across the developments in Nigeria, you've been watching this election. Well, what's your overall sense of how it's gone?
Well, analysts here and across the country are chiming in with their 2 cents. What I think the complexity of the events that are unfolding now demonstrates is the importance of journalists to be here and to be on the ground, documenting incidents as they happen, documenting the news as it's taking place, and to be able to do so freely.
Is it a case of not understanding the role of journalists when it comes to election, or do you think it's intentional to suppress what would be the voice of the people and the eyes of the people on ground during elections? And I ask that because politicians worldwide, including here in Nigeria, tend to label as bias or fake news what does not favor them, what is being reported during elections.
It's a really good question. The motivations of actors, they should be put to them. We should be asking questions of the heads of the security forces when their agents interfere with journalists. What we can say is that journalists had their content deleted from their devices. When security forces are stopping journalists, taking their phones and deleting footage or photographs, that sends a pretty clear message.
And again, I mean, I return to the issue of the election. I noticed you didn't quite want to get into it, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot there, but I mean, you're a journalist. I mean, you can't have come to Nigeria and not noticed the things that are happening around, I mean, Africa's biggest ballot. Is it your sense that the process has been one that you can hang legitimacy on?
Again, I don't know that I'm in the best place to answer that question. I think there are people who are very qualified and well placed to do so. But at the same time, I can say that a fundamental question that's being discussed here is a question of transparency. And again, I'll return to the importance of access on election day for journalists to be there to document what's happening at polling stations, to document voters and their perspectives. And really that's what we're trying to emphasize, is that that kind of access, that kind of freedom is crucial for the democratic process here in Nigeria.
Well, covering elections is not like covering any other story. We're talking dusk to dawn, marathon coverage, reportage, and all of that. If you could change anything with what you have seen, I know you don't want to speak specifically about the conduct of the elections, but with what you have seen and journalists on the field, what are your concerns and what would you change?
Well, we spoke to journalists, over 50 journalists and members of civil society ahead of the elections, my colleague Evelyn Okaku and I, and we heard from them serious concerns about their safety. They said, that the dynamic security situation across the country was something that they were very concerned about going into the election, of course, because they are going to be on the ground working around the clock essentially to document the news, and so their safety was paramount. They gave us tips to share with their colleagues, basically knowing the local context of where you're going to be as intimately as possible so that you can do the coverage effectively, but also stay safe while doing so.
And I mean, you talked about the fate of journalists. I mean, that's a fairly sort of big term. But I'm wondering, I hope you didn't mention this earlier, and if you did, I apologize for making you repeat yourself, but what's your sense of how widespread this issues with journalism is in Nigeria?
Well, what I can say is I was here in 2019 documenting incidents involving journalists during the elections, and we've been following the elections that have taken place over the last 4 years, and we've documented a trend in the elections in 2019 through now. The attacks on journalists, the interference with access has been consistent.
You've mentioned interference with access with at least 2-3 times since this conversation started, and I want us to have a bit on that, because we talk about fair and credible elections, and you talk about giving access to journalists to report as they see it, and it gives credibility to the process. So when we have a situation where journalists are stopped from doing their job, I mean, it's a vast country with over 176,000 polling units. Would it be fair or correct to say that in those places where journalists could not do their job because the authorities stopped them from doing their job, those elections will be questionable?
I wouldn't make that assertion, but what we would say is that the challenges that journalists were facing are similar to the ones that voters faced, that other observers faced. And so really the broad spectrum of concerns that people had during this election would be the ones that journalists also face.
So where have you been whilst you were in Nigeria?
Well, this trip I've been here documenting these incidents. Yes,
right, okay.
Working alongside the civil society organizations that have been here, not far from this studio, documenting the process as it takes place.
And how long are you going to be here for?
Well, I'll be here, leaving tomorrow, but back for the state elections in about a week and a half.
And how long have you been here?
Just a few days before the election I arrived, but again, we were here in October documenting the concerns of journalists, and I've been in Nigeria on several occasions before this.
But yes, indeed, you've been here because you've been on Arise News as well. And I want us to compare, because you've been monitoring journalists do their job on the continent of Africa. How would you describe the tolerance for the media in Africa, in Nigeria in particular, largest democracy?
Well, I would say, journalists across the continent face similar concerns. Chief among them, impunity, the lack of accountability when journalists are attacked by private citizens or by agents of the state. What really the press freedom community and media at large have been calling for is for those responsible for those attacks to be held accountable. And so really across the continent, but really across the world, this is not just an African issue. When journalists are attacked, there is, by and large, impunity.
Well, Jonathan, I want to thank you exceedingly for coming in and talking to us. Very interesting talking to you, and you know, we support what you're doing and congratulate you on the work that you're doing. Jonathan Rosen is a senior researcher at the Committee to Protect Journalists. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.